back to another episode of the Converge podcast. My name's Steve.
My name is Nate.
And we're here to help you have a Christian worldview in a post-Christian culture. Now, today we want to have a little bit of a different episode. Just a few weeks ago, we went down to New Orleans. We went to the Southern Baptist Convention. And I found out that a lot of people don't know that it's called the Southern Baptist Convention, specifically because we have a convention every year. But that's why it's called that. And we were down in New Orleans, which, if you are talking to a travel agent, is not a city that I personally would recommend you go to. I found myself questioning why anyone goes to New Orleans. There were people doing drugs on the streets. There were rats the size of cats everywhere.
Also true story.
Homeless colonies, and it was hotter than Florida. So if you're asking for a traveling tip from me, my tip would be go anywhere else. Because it's possibly the dirtiest city in America that I've been to. But the convention itself, we want to share basically, because leading up to this, we've had many podcasts where we've talked about what are some red lines with us where our cooperation with the Southern Baptist Convention is concerned. And a lot of those red line issues were actually dealt with this year at the convention. And so we wanted to give specifically to our church an update on our cooperation with the Southern Baptist Convention, how we see things progressing. Were good things taking place at the SBC this year? Were bad things taking place? And really just an overall recap of it and what we see happening moving forward with the SBC.
Yeah, we do get questions from church members about SBC happening, so we want to try to provide those answers. I do want to say at the start, if you're a member of Village Church and SBC politics is kind of like, well, how does that really affect me? Part of what I want to say is we intentionally make it so that it doesn't affect you at the local church level. And so you don't have to care about this. But at the same time, we want to be transparent to those who do care and try to give some answers.
No, of course. And, just to give you a little history, we originally, 15 years ago, partnered with the SBC to start this church. I worked as an associate church planning strategist for many years with our state convention. It's only been about 2 years since I stopped doing that so that I could focus solely on building Village Church to bigger and better. And so we like to do this just so that we're, number one, keeping all our cards on the table, because we never like for people to find out, we've got any secret affiliations or cooperations going on.
We're very open about the fact that we're an SBC church. Yeah. Every member's introduction, we state that very clearly.
We've been partnered with them with a lot of church planting efforts, with a lot of even strengthening churches in the state of Virginia efforts, planting churches in the state of Virginia. And I would say probably the biggest partnership that we've had with them over the years is with the International Mission Board, something we take part of the Lottie Moon Christmas offering every single year. Right now, we are designating the totality of our national SBC cooperation to the International Mission Board because of a lot of shenanigans that we think have been taking place inside of the SBC, specifically financially, but also with some doctrinal issues. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. And the big one that we talked about was the vote as to whether or not Saddleback Church out in Orange County, California, whether or not that should be disfellowshipped.
Yep, and that we had stated earlier podcast, that was a red line. Saddleback was just blatantly appointing women pastors, and then it turned more than that. They were being very belligerent about that fact, and they were openly saying they wanted to take the SBC in an egalitarian direction. And so this past year, the executive committee, as their distinguished to do that, had voted to expel them, and now it came to the members at the convention to uphold that vote. And we weren't sure how that was going to go. I did think that they were going to uphold that vote, but that was a red line. If they had voted Saddleback back in, that would have been a huge problem. But they did, in fact, uphold that and vote them out.
And it was actually very encouraging because I think the vote was over 88% of the messengers, and of course we were in the room. Yep. We voted, and over 88% of the SBC messengers present voted to disfellowship Rick Warren. Now, if you're confused as to why, if all that you know about Rick Warren is that 25 years ago you read Purpose Driven Life and it had a huge impact on your life, and you're like, why would you guys be picking on such a giant in the faith, somebody that was a hero in the faith? And I would say it wasn't a fight that we chose. The Baptist faith and message, and I think this is the crux of the issue, and this is why Al Mohler spoke to it very well at the convention, is that the Baptist faith and message kind of grounds what it is that we are cooperating around as a convention.
Yeah.
And I think what a lot of people are confused about is that when they think about Baptists, they just kind of think about, okay, well, you're autonomous churches, so you believe what you believe, we believe what we believe, and then we come together and we do missions work together. And I don't think a lot of people understand how chaotic that would be and how improbable and impossible that would be. So anytime you are cooperating with anyone or anything, you have to understand that there has to be an anchor, there has to be some sort of foundational agreement between the two of you that this is the basis of our cooperation. And in the SBC, I think one of the more confusing things is we don't simply cooperate around missions efforts. So it's not solely a practical cooperation. If it was solely a practical cooperation, then being a Baptist would be meaningless, and there would be Presbyterians involved, there would be Catholics involved. There would really be no fences around what it means to be a Baptist, or even more specifically in this category, what it means to be a Southern Baptist. And so Southern Baptists currently have a document called the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. And the reason that 2000 is on there is because that is the year that it was ratified, that this is the document that we were going to be cooperating around. Very controversial document, one that still has problems being enforced in the convention, and one that we, of course, take the posture that needs to be enforced more vigorously by the convention, that if you don't agree with what the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 says, and we have a link to it on our website, it's a document that we use as part of our doctrinal statement, but if you don't agree with the Baptist Faith and Message 2000, then you're simply not a Southern Baptist. And that's kind of the long and the short of that, but inside of that document is a clear, no matter how ambiguous people want to pretend it is a clear statement that pastors and the office of pastor is solely for qualified men. A woman cannot, no matter how good her speaking ability is, no matter how bright she is, no matter how much theology she knows, we believe that in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul sets up clear guidelines that match the original created order from the book of Genesis that formed a patriarchy where leadership is concerned, that it is men who are pastors. And so in the SBC, one of the great things that this document did is it gave a clear dividing line that if you believe a woman should and can be a pastor, you should not cooperate with the Southern Baptist Convention. But as in all things, the SBC is so large that there are somewhere, I think it's over 1,000, probably over 1,500. I think it's just under 2,000 was the number that Mike Law gave. Almost 2,000 churches have women on staff in the role, some form of pastor. And so for the past few years, there's been a semantical argument over whether or not being a pastor is an office, whether or not it's just a gift, whether or not the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 only refers to the office of senior pastor. And that's kind of one of the more laughable ones because the document's not so old that you can't ask the guys that wrote
Right.
it what they meant. And Al Mohler is one of the guys, and he has clearly stood up and said, no, we mean anyone being called a pastor in the office of pastor when we write that. So a few years ago, Rick Warren decided to change his mind on this issue, and he decided that a few years ago they should ordain three women as pastors at Saddleback Church. And more recently than that, he has retired, and he's chosen to use his retirement to bring in a husband and wife team to lead Saddleback, and they are going to be a senior pastoral team of husband and wife, ordaining both of them as the senior pastors of Saddleback Church. And so the way it went down is that the executive committee, it would be impossible really of a task for them to just look at all 45,000 or so Southern Baptist churches and really start looking at it and saying, okay, we're going to kick these people out. The way that it works, for better or not, it's not in my opinion, this isn't a good apparatus, but people have to refer a church to what is called the Credentials Committee, And then for that calendar year, the credentials committee looks at that church, whether or not they align with the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 or whatever it is that they've been reported to them for. And then the credentials committee makes a recommendation to the messengers at the SBC as to whether or not a church should be fellowshipped. Then it goes, or disfellowship, then it goes to the executive committee, and the executive committee made the decision to disfellowship them. It can then be appealed by that church. And what I think is fascinating about something that happened this year is that my understanding is for the history of the SBC, they have disfellowshipped a lot of churches over the years for many, many different reasons. But they have never had anyone show up at the actual convention to appeal being disfellowshipped. And this year, we had 3 churches show up to be disfellowshipped. Now, I might be a conspiracy theorist, but I just kind of have a feeling that Rick Warren didn't want to be the only one appealing this year. And I think some funny business may have gone on behind closed doors where they actually recruited 2 other churches. They probably tried to recruit more, but 2 other churches showed up to appeal being disfellowshipped. Rick Warren gave, they had 3 minutes to publicly appeal, and then Al Mohler represented the executive committee in their appeal. And the amount of vitriol, I think, that Rick Warren said was wild.
Yeah.
You have anything to say about that?
I would say he was not appealing that they hadn't violated our doctrine. He was appealing that our doctrine was wrong. And so that's what people need to understand. And the weeks leading up to it, he honestly got crazier and crazier online, posting things on social media. It was clear that he was there to cause disunity in the convention. It was very obvious.
It didn't appear to me that it was a well-intentioned appeal.
Yeah.
It was kind of, in the weeks leading up to it, he started a website. He put a bunch of videos out about why he had chosen to be egalitarian. I covered a lot of why that those were foolish arguments on an earlier podcast. But he showed up. His appeal was more vitriol than anything else. And 88% of the SBC voted him out. That was very encouraging for me. Some of the missteps outside of that kind of show how just weird-minded some people in the SBC are, where it's like we have 88% support to disfellowship an egalitarian church, but then they also overwhelmingly keep people in offices that don't want to disfellowship those churches. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But understand that I think Rick Warren's probably trying to start his own network. I think that's what's going to happen next.
Yeah, it was really clear he was kind of doing this to build a platform. Not that he doesn't have a platform, but he's building a platform for egalitarianism. And so I'm glad the convention voted the way that they did. One other thing I think to understand in this whole thing is, like, you were talking earlier about what a Baptist is, and there's so many different kinds of Baptists, but our doctrinal statement defines what a Southern Baptist is, and that's what we're ultimately talking about. But people do, I think, understand that egalitarianism leads places. So it comes from cultural accommodation, and what's funny is Rick Warren is even admitting that in a lot of things. Like, he tries to give a little pass to say, oh, I just started studying the Bible more seriously after 40 years in ministry.
It's such a strange, like,
ridiculous.
That's a knock on yourself.
Yeah, but then he says other things to make it very obvious this is a cultural accommodation for them. But it leads other places. It leads to LGBT affirmation, and we already see that in things Saddleback is doing that already have pro-LGBT ministries in their church. And Andy Stanley at North Point is doing the exact same thing.
And I think a lot of people don't realize how important egalitarianism is to not just doctrinal faithfulness, but faithfulness where sin is concerned and understanding what is sin and being able to define sin. When you flatten out gender and you say there can be no distinction, there can be no difference between male and female, that's what you're saying when you say, I'm an egalitarian. I don't think a lot of people understand that that's what they're doing. When you say that a woman should be able to serve in the office of pastor, what you're saying is, leadership-wise, there's no distinction. Well, that's going to bleed over then into the family to say there's no distinction where the leadership role of the father and the mother is concerned, and that affects everything. And so eventually, if you take it to its logical conclusion, once you have flattened out gender where leadership is concerned, it necessarily then goes into intimacy. It then goes into sexuality. It then goes into even what is gender, what is a man, what is a woman. And there's no way where that train doesn't keep moving down the road. And what you're actually seeing with Saddleback, what you're seeing with North Point and Andy Stanley right now, you're seeing really kind of a slow march to affirmation, where it really is behind closed doors. Both of those churches are affirming over LGBTQ plus issues. But publicly, they haven't made those statements yet. And the thing is once you go egalitarian, things move so fast now. Just wait 5 years, and they'll be fully affirming publicly of LGBTQ issues.
Yep. All right, moving on. So that was a big win. Absolutely. Another big win was the Mike Law Amendment. What that amendment was clarifying our doctrinal statement, which you kind of alluded to earlier. It was clear, honestly. We shouldn't have needed this. And it was clear enough to disfellowship Saddleback. But Mike Law wanted to add an amendment, just making it extra clear that only men can serve as pastors.
Isn't to the Baptist faith and message. Am I correct on that? This amendment is actually to our bylaws.
Yes. Yep.
Which affects the BF&M.
Right, how we interpret it. Yeah. So he wanted to amend it, basically making it very clear that the Credentials Committee should disfellowship any church that has a woman serving as any kind of pastor. And going into the convention, honestly, I didn't think that was going to pass, and for multiple reasons. One of it is a lot of the leaders of the SBC were telling people not to pass it. Barber was telling people not to pass it. Baptist 21 was telling people not to pass it. A lot of the past presidents, even organizations like Nine Marks and Pillar had not spoken out in favor of the amendment. So I didn't think it had the capital to pass. But one thing that I think happened is people were so taken aback by Rick Warren and the way he displayed himself that they kind of realized that something like the Mike Law Amendment to clarify our stance on complementarianism was needed.
Well, if you give somebody that's being influenced by demons enough rope, it eventually is exposed for the folly that it is, and then the Holy Spirit that is in people will, by God's grace, win them over. And I think that is a little bit of what happened. Yeah. It was super frustrating leading up to it.
Right.
Kind of the way the SBC life works is you have all these little organizations that kind of branch off and form brotherhoods and partnerships and networks within the SBC. And we've been friendly with a lot of networks over the years that we're not even really friendly with anymore because of issues like this. But like you said, you had Nine Marks. And what fascinates me about Nine Marks is that he was very bold once he got to the convention, and they had a meeting, I think Monday night, where Mark Dever, he didn't come out publicly for the amendment, but he necessarily espoused complementarian doctrine.
Yeah, I think they saw where the wind was blowing, honestly. They saw the groundswell of support for the amendment, and they just realized this is going to pass. We need to be in favor of it. And actually, part of what Nine Marks did, which I think Juan Sanchez is affiliated with them, or maybe it's another. Anyway, Juan Sanchez added to the amendment, even clarifying it further, which I didn't think was a bad clarification at all, and kind of got all those groups to support it, and ended up passing it by 70% at least.
Yeah, and so the way that this type of amendment works is it has to have a 2/3 vote. And so if you think about the way the United States Congress works, it's called a supermajority. And so any type of amendment like this has to have a supermajority, a 2/3 vote in order to pass, but then it also has to pass next year as well.
Yeah.
And so it has to happen 2 years in a row. And so next year, the SBC will be in Indianapolis. I pray that it's nicer than New Orleans was.
I think it will be.
And it has to have a 2/3 vote in Indianapolis as well to fully pass. And so the question that is going to happen for me is when you think about kind of networks that were good when they started, like Baptist 21, like the Pillar Network, that are very slowly moving towards egalitarianism. I don't find either one of them to be trustworthy, mostly because they have people by the name of Aiken attached to them. But neither one of them being trustworthy, I think over the next year, you're going to see some funny business take place with a lot of those influential guys to try to derail it from being passed a second year in a row.
Yeah, I do want to clarify this point so people understand where we're coming from. There was a lot of discussion the months prior to the convention about this amendment. And particularly, let's just single out some people. Baptist 21, You had multiple podcasts telling people not to vote for the amendment. And so I'm not going to let them get away now with acting like they were always for it.
Right.
They wanted it to fail. And you got to ask yourself why. And that's, a little bit of what we'll get into here.
Yeah, you got to be careful with those guys. They'll shake your hand on Monday, punch you in the face on Tuesday. You never really know what those jellyfish are going to be like. But the fact of the matter is, it is a good amendment because it shores up the complementarian issue. It shores up the distinction of gender. It shores up the office of pastor. It shores up our identity. And so often in conversations like this, what people will do is they will try to kind of obfuscate the issue. They'll throw a bit of a red herring in there, and they'll make the statement, but isn't this a secondary issue? And the first thing I would say is most denominational work cooperates around secondary issues. It's why I don't look at Presbyterians and say you're not Christians. Our distinction isn't the primary issue of the gospel. It is, in a sense, a secondary issue problem. But when it comes to some secondary issues, understand that not all of them are created equal, that some of them can very quickly, by the nature of the way that you define it, can become a primary issue very, very quickly. And so that's why I would say the difference between egalitarianism and complementarianism is so important in our day and age because of all of the gender insanity that we have, that once you kind of blur the lines of distinction where the office of pastor is concerned, you are not far off from affirming LGBTQ issues, and that is when it then necessarily becomes a primary issue. So there are secondary issues that will become a hill on which you need to die on, and gender is one of those hills.
Yeah, and it's why you have to understand, why do we have all these churches seeking to make women pastors where they didn't have them before? Right. Why are you having all these churches filled with positions where they're calling women a minister of this and that? It's cultural accommodation. They're looking for a place to accommodate to the culture, to say, we're not like those other Christians who are patriarchal. So there's a big issue behind the issue. And I do think that's another thing to understand. Why were these leaders, before the amendment passed, this was really a groundswell of the people. Why were the leaders trying to hold back the people to not pass the amendment? I think it's because they don't want to deal with these 1,900 churches that have female pastors. And they know now that the precedent has been set with Saddleback, that if we disfellowship Saddleback, we're going to have to disfellowship these other churches.
How many churches are being reported to the Credentials Committee at this point?
Yeah. And that's the reason. So the reason is they don't want to deal with the mess. And so that's why they didn't want that amendment to pass.
Yeah, I think it's that. It's such poor leadership. And I mean, just recently, there is a subset inside of the SBC, the North American, African American something. It's a subset of the SBC, and we know because we have a friend they're trying to get him involved because he's an African American pastor, and he point blank said that even in the state of Virginia, the leader of that in the state of Virginia has female pastors on his staff.
Yeah.
And so they have released a statement basically saying, are you going to kick all of us out? And they turned it from an issue of dealing with female pastors to where now, if you try to disfellowship churches with female pastors, you're somehow a racist because so many black churches have female pastors. And it's awful. That is sinful.
Yep.
And Bart Barber, old BB, and let me tell you, the only word I can think of to talk about the way that he talks, that dude is a simp. And he has come out now saying, well, this needs to be part of the conversation that we have to figure out what we need to do moving forward. Again, accommodation.
Exactly.
That is weak leadership. Point blank, if Saddleback Church should be disfellowshipped over female pastors, guess what? So does every other church in the SBC that has female pastors. It doesn't matter what ethnicity your church represents, doesn't matter what race your church is a majority representative of, but you need to be kicked out. And it has nothing to do with the issue of race, everything to do with faithfulness to our documents of what we cooperate around.
So if you want feedback from how the convention went. We've had 2 victories here we talked about. We disfellowshipped Saddleback, the amendment passed. Why then am I not viewing the convention as an overall total success? And it's because of these issues we're talking about. We still have a total and complete systemic failure of leadership in the convention. And people need to understand that is the root issue we're dealing with. There were some victories, like we won some battles.
Yep.
But the overall war is still going to be our leadership. And so the same people that in the room, I think it was almost 90% disfellowshipped Rick Warren, at least 70% passed this amendment, then turned around and 75% voted for the president who didn't want us to pass that same amendment. He was always against disfellowshipping Saddleback, but he's trying to play this line. And so we have a leadership failure, and we see this up and down the board. And that's ultimately what I would point to as the biggest issue in the SBC that still needs to be addressed is our poor leadership.
Yeah, and then towards the end of the convention, when many people had to leave to catch their flight or whatever have you, you saw former presidents of the SBC. And this is what's so strange. You had J.D. Greer, you had James Merritt, who's always a great time. You had Steve Gaines, you had Ed Litton. You had all these guys get together and wanted to appoint a study committee. Whenever somebody wants to appoint a study committee, it's like back in the 90s when Bill Clinton said, it depends on what your definition of is. All right, so Bill Clinton is basically like, well, we have to define this word. It's so ambiguous, I don't know what it means. Well, that's what liberals do.
Yeah.
Is they always want to form a study committee to find out, what do we mean by friendly cooperation? What do we mean by pastor? And so this coalition, it's almost like in the book of Joshua where we are right now. It's the coalition of wicked kings got together, and they want to stand against the onslaught of God's people. And they want to form a study committee to figure out what do we even mean by these words.
Let's be really clear. That study committee is to figure out how we can not disfellowship those 1,900 churches that the people of the SBC just voted overwhelmingly to proceed towards disfellowshipping. That's the purpose of it. How can we figure out a loophole so that we don't have to actually hold to our doctrine? That's what that study committee is for.
Mm-hmm. And, it's just when the messengers, and I really do think that this is an elitist problem.
It is.
I think that these guys believe that all of the messengers are troglodytic, that they're less than people. They can't think through the issues, and we need to depend on the former presidents because they are the ones with leadership experience, and we need to depend on them to make these types of decisions for us. That when the will of the people is absolutely clear, in order to stop the people, they use phrases like, well, we need to start a study committee.
Yep. So we got that going on. And then there's more leadership issues, just that, though. The convention did not deal with financial accountability. And that was through multiple things that I think it's worth it kind of laying out for our people to understand. One, before the convention, and I was really disappointed that this wasn't addressed at all, but before the convention, it came out that Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, which is one of our main seminaries in the SBC, has had major financial problems over the last decade to the tune of $150 million in deficit spending. That is astronomical and unbelievable. So over the last 10 years, they have spent down almost their whole endowment. The school is on the brink of bankruptcy. And our leadership is such that no one has said anything about it.
Can we just talk about how impressive that is?
It's
$150
amazing.
million is a tremendous amount of money. I would like to try to spend that much money, get myself that much in the red. Like, I'm impressed by it.
Yeah.
But only wickedness makes you such a bad steward
That's
of
the
God's
deficit.
resources.
That's not just how much they spent. That's the deficit. They were spending $6 to $7 million more it was more than 10 years, over 15 years, I think, more than they had every year. And this is the kind of leadership that we had. No one stopped to say anything. When I say leadership, I don't just mean the president, because obviously that was mismanaged at the presidential level. But it's the board of trustees who are appointed to be the board of directors for that institution.
This shows when people in SBC leadership say, oh no, every entity is held accountable by the board of trustees. This is a board of pastors and leaders throughout SBC churches that are supposed to hold the entities accountable to many things, including financial stewardship. Yeah. And what the Southwestern problem shows is that our board of trustees system is irreparably broken.
Yeah.
I mean, it's completely broken.
Yeah, it's a bunch of yes men who just say,
Which, by the way, Bart Barber was one of the trustees for Southwestern.
yeah. That means for 15 years, I think it was, every year they would get a report saying we're $6-7 million in the red. And they just said everything is awesome for 15 years in a row. All right, we got a problem. And
If we did that, I can only imagine you would form a coup against us. You would leave.
But what you got to understand is this is the trustee system. It's the same. Every single entity, and I will say that definitively, has this same problem right now. Mm-hmm. Every single entity does.
Oh, absolutely. We dealt with, and this is kind of a bigger issue where right now I just saw a picture. I saw a video tour of Lifeway's new multi-million-dollar facility. And a lot of people don't realize that Lifeway has been a failed organization for over a decade. They've had to file bankruptcy. They had to sell most of the property that they owned in Nashville. And now they have just unveiled a Google-esque center of operations for Lifeway as an organization. And no one is holding them accountable for it. And the reason that this happens in the SBC is because of the way that the cooperative program works, that they can spend, and faithful men and women in local churches are going to continue to give until people just decide you can't have any more.
The people who are supposed to be holding them accountable are hoping for denominational jobs and different favors, and that's just the reality of what's happening.
Yeah, and we saw Brent Leatherwood from the ERLC, when people did have questions to ask him from the floor, he responded completely rude, very dismissive of the messengers. It's almost an attitude, and the guy from Lifeway did the exact same thing. It's almost as if, how dare you peasants question how we spend your money? Yeah.
Someone questioned the leader of Lifeway about why are we selling material that obviously contradicts our stated doctrinal statement. And the Lifeway guy said, haven't you read this author's memoir? Don't you know they're a nice person? I mean, it's just very dismissive, just doesn't answer questions. NAM continues to be my biggest concern in terms of entities that are not held accountable. They have hundreds of millions of dollars in assets and savings and real estate, and they are not financially accountable to where that money is going.
It's not just that they aren't accountable. It seems like they cannot be accountable.
They refuse to be.
They can't tell you where a lot of the money is going. They can't tell you how it's spent. And one of the lowlights, I would say, of the SBC was when Kevin Ezell, who's the president of Lifeway, who's responsible for leading that entity, he was asked, can we have some financial accountability? Because look at what Eric Greenway, was that his name?
Adam Greenway.
What he did at Southwestern. Yeah. I mean, you're looking at a guy, his personal coffee maker was $15,000. He somehow spent, I think it was $68,000 on Christmas decorations. He had $180,000 in his home's HVAC. I don't even know how he did that. Must be the best air conditioner ever. I want it. But when pressed about Ezell being more accountable, his response, and this is where I think sometimes people reveal how foolish they are in just accepting what you're told. He made it. His literal response was, "Well, brother, I buy my Christmas decorations at Hobby Lobby, and my coffee maker is a $69 Keurig." And it's just like, that is a total just completely ignoring the actual question of accountability. What was requested at the convention was for each entity, specifically NAM, North American Mission Board, to present a 990, which is how nonprofits are held accountable by the IRS, a 990 type form that accounts for the money that was brought in and the money that went out of the organization to be presented to the messengers of the Southern Baptist Convention. And basically the way that they treated that was as though the messengers were wicked for asking for such accountability. And then Ezell chose to lie about many of these issues to the convention.
Yeah, he did. I mean, let me just specify how he lied, because I think it's important. Because this is I would say this is the single biggest issue in the SBC right now, and the worst thing that happened in the convention is Kevin Ezell lied from the stage. And I realize that's a weighty accusation, but I think it's obvious. So the first thing he said was, our trustees keep us accountable. That's not the lie. It's not true, but
Right.
you can say that and who can prove that? But he said, anyone who requests that financial information, we provide it. Well, we know for a fact multiple people have requested that information over the last few years, and they will not provide it. And then the other thing, and this is even worse, I think, is someone asked Kevin Ezell, how did it come to be, because we had just Disfellowshipped Saddleback, how did it come to be that the former pastor of Echo Church, who is now the pastor of Saddleback, he was a NAM training center. While he had female pastors on staff, he was a NAM training center for years. And Kevin Ezell just lied. He lied, and he said that, we use all kinds of different buildings for our training centers. It doesn't mean we have any affiliation. So you just need to you're asking a silly question. We just use their building. And that was a lie.
So he specifically said, and so I know how these NAM assessments work because I used to do them. And what Ezell said was that when they're looking for a place to assess church planters, well, brothers, we rent Marriott's, we'll rent a Hilton Hotel ballroom. Yeah. One time we rented an Episcopalian church just because it met our needs. And that was the relationship that we had with Echo Church. Literally a lie. And people have the receipts where one of the pastors of Echo Church was literally appointed by the North American Mission Board as the assessment director for the state of California. He was on the payroll of the North American Mission Board. They did not just rent the facility. They were partnering financially with the church's leadership.
Yeah. And the other thing he lied about is he said some things were in place before I came on board here. Echo Church was involved with Send, NAM, church planner training for 5 or 6 years after Kevin Ezell came on board. So that was a lie.
The Send City campaign was one of Kevin Ezell's initiatives. Yeah. So to pretend that you don't know what's going on with an initiative that you started, even if he, as the president, and I understand, it's a large entity, even if he didn't know the specifics of how it was working out, those whom he appointed as responsible for the way that these things worked out, they knew.
Here's what keeps happening. And I don't expect Kevin Ezell, as the leader of NAM, to know every little thing that's going on in that organization and every even employee or appointee. He couldn't. It's too big. But what keeps happening is major flaws are pointed out, especially in the area of egalitarianism, and they kind of cover it up and say, oh, that's not happening anymore. But no one's ever held accountable. No one's ever held accountable to why an egalitarian church in California was put in charge of Send training. Never any accountability for that. Yeah. It's just said, some excuse is made and it's supposed to be corrected, but then we keep finding more things and there's never accountability. And that's the root issue. No one ever gets fired.
Yeah. Yeah. They play fast and loose with doctrine. They play fast and loose with money. And when anybody has the audacity to say, hey, can we stop and think about this for a minute? You are actually accused, and the word everybody loves, you're slandered because you are preventing, according to them, the mission of Jesus and church planting to move forward. And, I'm willing to say that while the last few years of planting churches in Virginia and beyond, I think has been very discouraging because of a lack of church planting that is going on, as well as the watering down of assessments that were becoming so much more robust under Acts 29's assessment that I was a part of. NAM's assessment got really good. In the state of Virginia, we started having such better assessment that people were actually starting to get turned down from church planting. And we've reversed all of that just so that we can go back to the days where we just claim a lot of numbers. Now they're claiming that in the past 10 years, we have planted over 10,000 churches at this point. But there's really no accountability.
Can't prove that at all.
To number one, proving it, but number two, and that was another thing that he said. He was like, no, this isn't the old way where we just threw a number out there. We can prove it. And my question is, well, then let's see the list. I want to see the list of 10,000 churches, but I also want to see, are those actually Southern Baptist churches?
Let me because we could go on and on about NAM. Let me try to sum this up a little bit. Here's the issue. The amount of money that they get is staggering. All right, we're hundreds of millions a year, and we know because of property they have and different reports that have come out, probably $400 to $500 million in assets.
They're sitting on a war chest right now of $500 million.
And the average church plant, even the good one that we would affirm and say, this is a good church plant, they're going to get 20 grand if they're lucky. The numbers don't add up. And yet every single time that someone in the SBC seems to need a parachute job landing, all of a sudden there's a new vice president at NAM.
Yeah.
All right. And which you can't find online anymore. You can't find the list of their vice presidents, but at one point it was 30, 40 of them. So we have a lot of questions.
If you planted a numerically successful church, when you get to around 50, your retirement plan now is to become a vice president at NAM.
Seems
and
like
nobody can figure out what it is that you even do there.
So the issue is, like, we need to know we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars, and it doesn't seem like there's a lot of church planning happening. Now, here's what I will say. I believe we've talked about this on previous podcasts. I think it's because America, as far as evangelicalism goes, is drying up in terms of producing new pastors. That's not NAM's fault, but they need to be honest about it and not just hoard all the money. All right, we need to be honest about the fact that our seminaries, our churches are not producing enough young men who want to plant churches, but we're not. And what should be happening is if we have fewer men planting churches, we should be giving each of them more money to be more successful. But what happens is they still get the same little bit amount of money, and we get more and more VPs and more of a war chest in the bank for who knows what. We need answers to these questions.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think that a lot of the messengers where that kind of stuff is concerned, they want to continue to simply be excited about the amount of money that is being raised. So they voted down any type of accountability
that was discouraging,
where finances are concerned. And that was discouraging.
2 points, it came to an actual vote to the messengers. Should we require our entities to have financial accountability, transparency? And the messengers voted those things down. Because the platform, the executive committee, the president told them, you don't know what the consequences of this are. You need to just refer this to a committee. And we're at the point now where whatever the consequences are, we need financial transparency.
Absolutely. One pastor has noted that the SBC is now clearly divided into two camps. And I think that is an accurate assessment. There are people who think everything's going good and don't rock the boat, don't make changes. Everything looks good on paper. And so we're raising more and more money. And that would be encouraging if the more and more money was matched by more and more reports of what they're doing with that money, how they are capitalizing on the war chest, but they aren't doing it. We do need a distraction right now from the amount of money that we are raising to ask some hard questions. Hey, I don't feel bad asking leaders hard questions. People ask me hard questions all the time about my leadership, and I don't feel bad about asking them because that is what guys like Kevin Ezell, that is what Paul Chitwood, that is what you signed up for when you became a leader. Yeah. So when you respond to a hard question as though the plebes are asking you, and these guys don't deserve your time of day, understand that the message is starting to be received by at least half of the convention, that you just simply cannot be trusted with our finances.
Yep. We need a change in leadership. I mean, you either think everything's going great and we can continue on as we are, or you're part of the half of churches, and it's getting to be a 50-50 split, who think we need a change in leadership. We need to head in a different direction.
Yeah, and quite frankly, that's why we're so cautious where SBC issues are concerned. We've enjoyed our partnership with the SBC for as long as we've been in the SBC. I think it's been a fruitful partnership in many different ways. But I mean, when you think about it, that we had leaders who wanted to abandon complementarianism as a convention.
Yeah.
It's pretty hard not to be discouraged by that. It's pretty hard not to kind of step back and take note and say, I think maybe we need to really do some hard work of seeing first what's really going on in the convention, but then secondly, we need to do the hard work of finding better leaders.
That's it.
And that's how the conservative resurgence back in the 80s and 90s, that's how that happened, is that we had to get rid of everybody. We had to start afresh with better leaders who were better minded.
We've got to get rid of the good old boys club that are just looking out for denominational jobs. We're not going to make it long term, and not much longer at all. If we don't stop that.
Yeah.
So where do we stand now?
Well, we're glad that right now we are designating all of our SBC giving to international missions
Yeah.
at this point. That's what we're doing with our money. Now, I do want to caution people on that to say, yeah, we're doing that, and we think that works, but I also know that there were a lot of people who were designating part of their money to disaster relief. And then last year, Send Relief just gave $3 million to the Sex Abuse Task Force. And so now we're at a place where I don't even trust the designation of funds are actually going to where we say they are, because they treat it really weird. It's funny money once it actually gets to the SBC. And it seems like there is no dividing line between the entities, even financially. And so while you may designate it to go to one place, well, once that place gets it, it would appear that they have the freedom to send it elsewhere. And so when stuff like that is going on, again, it discourages you from trusting the leadership of those entities and what's going on. And I think this is the right call until they decide who's in charge and what direction we're headed in. Who's going to win what, unfortunately, I would call a current war within the SBC for what really is the heart of the SBC moving forward.
That's where we are.
And that's the update for the SBC. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We hope that it was helpful to you and to where you're able to wrap your mind around some of the way that things work when we're trying to reach the world with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day.